Welcome to the Faith Science Podcast, episode 22. I'm your host, Jerry Sweafford, and on this podcast, we explore the integration of science with faith. In today's podcast, I want to talk about the design argument, and I want to look at it from the perspective of the human body and why the human body is evidence for the existence of God. We've talked about some of this before because I'll be using my book to talk about it, but we'll get started on that in a second. But before I get to that, just a quick update on last week. The last week's podcast on what moral basis does an atheist condemn slavery in the Bible. I did that podcast just kind of as an answer, quick answer to something that Mark Alsop said at the end of our podcast from 2 weeks ago. So if you haven't seen either one of those, or watched either or listened to either one of those, go give those a listen. I interviewed Mark Alsop, who is an atheist, and at the end of the interview, I asked him, as I do each of my guests, for a scripture or a quote that he wanted to share, and he gave something from the Old Testament that he was using to suggest that God was endorsing slavery and that he was immoral for doing so. So last week I wanted to dig a little bit more, not only into the scripture that he gave, but into a lot of other scriptures that people often don't know about. For example, scriptures that tell the Israelites that if they come across a runaway slave, they are to treat that slave well and not return them to their masters, which is the exact opposite of the Fugitive Slave Act, which existed in America. There's another law shortly after the Ten Commandments in the book of Exodus, in which God tells the people that they are not to kidnap and enslave people. And that law carried the death penalty behind it. And if you were caught with a slave that had been kidnapped and sold, that also carried the death penalty. So these kinds of things would have eradicated the chattel slavery that we generally associate with the term slavery. So we talked a lot about that kind of thing, and then really just drilled down on what is the moral basis for the atheist who tries to claim that slavery is an inherently wrong thing. We see in the scripture that slavery is discussed and God regulates it in the Old Testament. And even when we get to the New Testament, we see that the people of God are to be slaves of Jesus Christ. Peter, Paul, and James each address books that they wrote by calling themselves a bondservant or a slave of Jesus Christ. So we're not talking about something that could be an inherently evil arrangement if we are to be the slaves of Jesus Christ. So we talked about that last week. If you haven't checked out that podcast, check it out, and maybe even check out the one with Mark as well. Today, we want to talk about the existence of God. We generally go between those two major topics on this podcast. It's an apologetics podcast, so we're talking mostly about the existence of God, whether we're talking about evidence or arguments for the existence of God. We're looking at that, and we'll be looking at one of those arguments today. Or we talk about the accuracy, inspiration of the Bible. And so last week was kind of more so talking about the Bible. This week, we're going to be talking more about the existence of God. And what I want to show is how the ability of humans to walk on two legs as efficiently and as effectively as we do is evidence for the existence of God and a creator that is beyond it, that his ability to design is beyond comprehension in terms of engineering. So some of you might know that I have a PhD in mechanical engineering. So my training is in engineering design for bachelor's and master's, and did some of that on the PhD level as well. And so there are many people that will tell you that the human body hasn't been designed. It just looks that way. But I can assure you that the people that are generally telling you this are biologists who don't have any training in engineering design. In fact, when you see books that say things like talk about the errors of the human body or those kinds of things, these are almost always biologists who have no training in engineering design trying to convince you that the body hasn't been designed. We're going to talk about one behavior that we do today that is clear evidence that the human body has been designed, and that is that we can walk on two legs. And not just that we can, but that we were made for it. And that's what we mean when we say design, that you can see a purpose in something that, again, just doesn't come about randomly. Because there's really two options here. When we look at the design of the human body, you can either say it wasn't really designed and you say something like evolution came up with it, or you do acknowledge the design in the human body and point out that there must be an intelligent designer behind that. So that's what we're going to be arguing for today and showing the anti or pseudoscientific nature of the evolutionary explanation. So let's start with the first idea here. That is that walking on two legs is really hard to do. This is important because it would be very easy for, if walking on two legs is something that can happen pretty straightforwardly or easily, then it would be easy to say, well, you don't need design in order to get walking on two legs. But the problem is walking on two legs is really hard, and it is an inherently unstable arrangement. And so there are three things that make reliable walking on two legs so remarkable. The first is that it's hard, that balancing on two legs is unstable rather than having three or four, which would be what we would call in engineering a statically stable arrangement. So balancing on two legs is unstable. The second thing is that the human body is actually structured for making balance on two legs easier. So there is what we'll call specialized hardware, to speak in robotics terms. That's my background as a robotics engineer. We have specialized hardware for this. Then the third thing is that every healthy human being learns to balance its body on two legs from scratch. We do not inherently have that. So we have a software in us. We have a specialized, we have an integrated software that goes along with that optimal or optimized hardware that allows us to do this. So those three things are remarkable. So let's talk about the difficult dynamics first. The fact that balancing on two legs rather than three or four is an unstable arrangement. If you look at this picture, and for those of you who are listening, I have a picture here of a four-legged stool and a two-legged stool. Which one's stable? Well, of course, you're going to say the four-legged stool is stable, and that's absolutely correct. It is statically stable is what we would call it, meaning if you have at least 3 points of contact with your surface, then you don't have to worry about it falling over. That's why a tricycle or a four-wheeler is a statically stable arrangement versus a bicycle or a motorcycle or a unicycle. You can't stand any of those up without them falling over. So if I have a two-legged stool, that's going to fall over. And likewise, a two-legged person has an inherently unstable arrangement. So you need something to be able to counteract the tendency that body is going to have for falling. Now, again, my PhD work was in basically designing algorithms. You could call it, well, it is artificial intelligence. I was designing artificial intelligence algorithms to train neural networks to learn balance and stability for two-legged robots, whether simulated or actual. And so that work really caused me to focus on the software, and we'll talk about that in a second. But one of the things that I had to wrap my mind around very early on with the project is how hard two-legged walking is. And if you don't study it, it's very easy for you to say, hey, everybody walks. It's easy. It's not easy, because we're talking about an inherently unstable arrangement. Okay, so we have this inherently unstable arrangement. And so what we need is specialized hardware to be able to stay upright. And humans have the optimized hardware to be able to stay upright. Here's a chart that gives several of those anatomical differences that we can see between quadrupedal, meaning four-legged primates, and humans, which are, of course, bipedal. They have two legs that they walk on. We are the only obligate bipeds, meaning the only obligate bipeds among primates, meaning that when you think about the classifications, we generally classify humans as being primates, and then all of these other primates, all of them are quadrupedal. The only ones that aren't are humans. We are the only obligate bipeds, which means we only walk on two legs. We don't have some other way of getting around. Again, of course, not counting babies. We're talking about those humans that are of age. So there are several different anatomical differences between quadrupedal primates and humans, which you can clearly see that there is a huge departure from humans and quadrupedal primates. And so, yes, you might look and say, well, that gorilla has eyes like a human does, and a nose kind of like a human, and a mouth kind of like a human. And so all of those things are true. And what people will often do is they'll look at some similarities like that and say, well, therefore, common ancestor. But you see, that's not evidence of a common ancestor, because you are assuming the common ancestor, but that could just as easily be evidence for a common designer. As someone who designs things, whether that's code or robots or whatever it is that I'm working on, you often use parts, code from a previous project on a later project. So it would make sense for a common designer to do similar things among different organisms that God made. And that's exactly what we see. Now, we can look at a picture of this where we see a quadrupedal ape and a bipedal human and see some of those differences between the ape and the human. And what you find is the differences are profound. There are many of them, if not hundreds, dozens at least of differences between the quadrupedal ape and the bipedal human. And the question arises, how do you get from that one place to the other when there are so many things that are so different that allow humans to walk on two legs? Well, that really brings us to, again, as we've said, the two main explanations for this. You're either saying that there was intelligent design where there is a creation by a designer, or you're saying that it's evolution. And so the next thing I want to talk about here is that walking on two legs is not the product of evolution. It cannot be the product of evolution. And the idea that it is the product of evolution is much more of a belief system than it is something that comes from science. And I know that people will say, no, it's science. No, it's not. And I'll show you why. There are at least three reasons to say that. But the thing I want to start with is that people often appeal to Darwin, even though that's increasingly being less of the case. People see the shortcomings with Darwin, whether you want to point out his racism, whether you want to point out, as I was listening to David Berlinski the other day, one of the things he pointed out is that if you just read On the Origin of Species, it's actually quite underwhelming. You read it and go, okay, what are you really saying here? Besides extrapolating from the small changes that we see to these larger changes that he had no way of being able to verify. And now that we know more about cells and DNA and that kind of thing, it has become clearer and clearer that it is not possible that this macroevolutionary idea that kind of began with Darwin. I know there are people that kind of had that idea prior, but what he had to say about natural selection and really tying microevolution and natural selection that people can actually observe to macroevolution, which was the thing he was proposing, that idea is becoming less and less tenable for people that do real science. And even from a mathematical perspective, we'll talk about that in a second. So Darwin basically extrapolates from microevolution, which everyone observes, to macroevolution, which is unobservable, it's unverifiable, and it's not scientific. So you have to believe it. So when people ask you, do you believe in evolution? That's basically why they ask you that. So as we think about why evolution couldn't have produced the bipedal balance, stability, walking that we see in humans, the reasons for this that I give are three reasons that are really the reason why evolution couldn't have happened in the first place. And so the first reason is that when you look at the what of evolution, you quickly find out that the what is not there. We don't have the evidence for the what that we should. You might be thinking, what are you talking about? So the fossil record is what I'm talking about here. And this is one of the things about Darwin that I can appreciate when you read his book. He points out, the fossil record doesn't show what I'm wanting or what I'm proposing. But what Darwin essentially said is, well, I know there are these gaps, but you shouldn't make you shouldn't make conclusions based off of the gaps. And the conclusion he was afraid of people making was that what he was saying wasn't true. But he had no problem using those gaps and filling them in with his evolutionary hypothesis. But he just doesn't want you to say, well, no, that doesn't fly. The other thing was that he would say, well, there might have been people that have come across these transitional forms that I'm saying should be there, and they just misclassified them. Now, the problem with that is you can just as easily, and I think this happens quite a bit actually, you can just as easily misclassify something as a transitional form that is actually not a transitional form at all. And this happens a lot. I had somebody when I was going in the comments, they went and copied and pasted some long list of so-called transitional forms. And they were saying, hey, you should look it up. There are all these transitional forms. Now, again, they didn't look it up. What they did was they copied and pasted something. If they had come to me and say, hey, here are these three, these are clearly transitional forms, then maybe it would be something to look at. So what I did is I looked at the very first one, and it was some reptile or lizard of some kind. And there was nothing that you looked at that and said, oh, that's a transitional form because X, Y, or Z. It was just some extinct reptile that was claimed to be a transitional form. You see how the nature of this stuff is, that you can just say it's a transitional form. Now, the issue here is that the fossil record doesn't contain a high number of transitional forms. Now, this is important because if everything that exists now came to be through this macroevolutionary process, then the fossil record should be filled. It should be brimming with all of these transitional forms. And by anyone's estimation, it is not. Now, people will tell you, oh, there's a lot of them. It's not just that there would need to be a lot of them. Even if you will account for sometimes the fossil record doesn't record everything, that's fine. If it is what has given rise to all organisms, then it should still be filled with these transitional forms, and it is not. And what happens is there are actually very few of them that people are willing to claim are transitional forms. And again, you can have some big long list where someone has claimed that. But again, in the grand scheme of the number of organisms or species that have ever existed, these transitional forms are actually very hard to come by comparatively. It would show, in the case of what we're talking about today, that there would be these quadrupedal apes that maybe had some kind of bipedal functionality or some bipedal transition between an ape and a human. And they'll show you these pictures of such things. The problem is they don't exist in the fossil record, and they would need to exist. We've got billions of people on Earth. Where are these transitional forms? Where's the multitude of them? So don't show me a piece of skull here and a piece of a femur here and a toe here, and then put that together and reconstruct some transitional form. But that's often the way this stuff works. And then they say, we found some transitional form, and you find out that what we're looking at is some kind of artist depiction of what they would like it to be, which again, they are inserting their faiths into this and whatever they're telling the artist and doing that depiction, and then trying to put this in textbooks for children and that kind of thing. So it's a faith system, and we just need to, be willing to admit and point this out. So the next thing is, not only do you not have the what, so whatever you're saying happened, that there's this transition, that there are these transitions all over the place, well, they're not in the fossil record. So you come up with this thing, but you have nothing in the fossil record to show it, or very little in the fossil record to show it. And you have to kind of believe the evolution first and then read that into the fossils. And that's not the same thing. Okay, the second thing is that the sequence of evolutionary changes is going to also need a corresponding series of selective pressures, or environmental pressures, let's call it. Meaning that if I say that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of changes that would need to take place to go from a quadrupedal ancestral ape to the modern day human, what you actually need is that you need to be able to show environmentally why natural selection would have pressured these organisms to move in that direction, and pressured a population of quadrupedal apes that are doing just fine into being less capable as quadrupeds, and then being really bad bipeds for a long time, and then eventually being really capable bipeds. You see, you cannot attribute forethought to evolution. That's not how it works. So it has to be selective pressures. But what you now have is that all of these selective pressures are taking you to intermediate places that only make sense if you have a final goal to get to. So this is the problem, that you now have this huge wasteland in between this capable quadruped and this efficient biped. And how do you get from one place to the other when each place in between needs to be a place that makes you better suited for your environment? But those places in between don't make you better suited for your environment. So it doesn't make sense that this, evolution will personify it for a second. It doesn't make sense that evolution, as this god of the gaps, would move you in this direction towards bipedalism. It doesn't make sense because you don't get better for your environment. Now, if you do, then you would need to be able to show how that would be the case. No one attempts to do this. They just simply claim that that's what happened. But you would need to show a sequence of selective or environmental pressures that would cause that transformation to occur over time. And no one attempts to do it because it would just be something you made up, which is, often the case with this kind of stuff. You could just make it up and it's not observable. It's not verifiable. In short, it's not science. Okay, so the third thing is that the proposed mechanism, which is this neo-Darwinian macroevolutionary process, that mechanism for these changes is not sufficient for producing the changes that you need, right? We're talking about dozens, if not hundreds, maybe more, maybe thousands of changes to get you from a quadrupedal ape to a bipedal human. And when you look at evolution, it doesn't do the job of getting you there. So I want to talk a little bit about mutations for a second, because this is one of those things that people claim when it comes to macroevolution. And the thing about it is, again, Darwin never said anything about mutations because he didn't know anything about genetics, because he was living in the 1800s, right? He didn't know anything about this. And so once people found out more about genetics, they kind of went back, and this is where this idea of neo-Darwinism comes from, that they came back and tried to meld the understanding of genetics and things like DNA and cells with what Darwin knew. But see, Darwin didn't know any of that. And I'm curious as to whether or not, if Darwin did know about cells and DNA, whether or not he would come to the same conclusions. But people who want the conclusions that come from the macroevolutionary perspective, they have pushed really hard to try to get it to be somewhat scientific. And what happens is you run into a great deal of problems. So what you have next is this third idea within talking about why evolution couldn't have produced bipedal gait and stability and balance, is that you would need to co-evolve optimized features. And we're going to talk about mutations in a second, but you would need to actually co-evolve the hardware and the software simultaneously to be able to get it to work. Okay. So for example, if I'm working on a robot and I change the hardware, it is necessary to then go back and change the software to make it as optimal as possible. And vice versa. You might change the software in some way, and if you can improve the hardware, that would be great. And you kind of have this back and forth between hardware and software to make things work. Now, clearly the hardware of a quadrupedal ape is much different than the hardware of a bipedal human. But it's not enough to say that you could just change the hardware alone. You'd actually also have to change the software. And so there's a back and forth that's happening here. But what we're told to believe is that back and forth, that going back and forth between this co-evolution of optimal software and hardware happens simultaneously through random, that is, unguided processes. So the evolutionary process is an unguided or undirected process. There's no intelligence behind it. But we end up with a uniquely designed human being that can walk on two legs. And that's what we're told to believe. But it doesn't make sense. And when we start talking about the mathematics of this is where it gets very interesting to me. My first degree was in mathematics, and so we're going to talk about combinatorics in a second as we get into mutations. So the evolutionary story is basically that this ancestral ape over time went from walking on all fours to being upright, and that it also had these changes to its body and to its neural circuitry to be able to, again, you change the neural circuitry to be able to take advantage of the optimal changes in the body and vice versa. But this happened through random processes, through undirected processes. That's how it happened. Well, again, that sounds great. It's a great story when you're a biologist. It's just from an engineering perspective, that's not how things work. You don't just randomly come about with optimized features. So when you start thinking about this idea that the mechanism for this coevolution of hardware and software was mutations, which again are changes to the genetic code, or undirected random changes to the genetic code, where as it is copied, it is not copied in the way that it was originally written, let's say. And again, who writes code? Well, designer writes code, but we'll get back to that later. You have this code, it's being copied, it's not copied correctly, and when it's not copied correctly, the idea is we call that a mutation. Now, in general, mutations are not helpful. There are people that want to point out that many of them are neutral. Okay, but they're not helpful. If someone says you have a mutation on this gene, you don't go, okay, what superpower do I have? Unless you're in the Marvel movies or watching X-Men. That's not how it works. But this is what these advocates are saying, that a compilation of various mutations is what has resulted in the changes for the better over time. I've got this book. I think I've got it over here. Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome. And it talks about how that idea of accumulating mutations is actually the opposite of the good that people are saying it is. It's just a thing that people have said because they want that to be true. But the accumulation of mutations has an overall negative effect on humans. It's not making us more evolved, as these people would say. They are harmful. And there is a decline in physical and mental abilities that people are that scientists are tracking. And so it's not getting better because there are more mutations. It's getting worse. And there are more diseases because of mutations, not fewer. But to hear these people say the mutations are the cause of this, one of the other things that gets said, secondly, is that mutations create this new genetic information. Well, that's not how you create new genetic information. And this brings us to the idea of combinatorics. So I want to use a simple illustration of this to make it a little bit easier for us to understand this. Let's say you have a 3-letter word that you're going to spell out. And to make the math easier, let's say that there are 20 letters in your alphabet. Okay. So you got 20 letters in your alphabet. You're creating a 3-letter word. How many different combinations can you come up with? Right? AAA, ABA, ACA, ADA. And if you just went down the line, you could have 20 different letters for the first letter, 20 different letters for the second letter, 20 different letters for the third letter. Mathematically, the number of combinations would be 20 to the third power. Now, what is that? Well, 20 times 20 is 400. 400 times 20 is 8,000. So if you have a 3-letter word with 20 letters in your alphabet, you would have 8,000 different combinations. Now, the next question is interesting. If you have 8,000 different combinations, how many of those combinations are actually useful? How many of them are actually words? So, for example, AAA is not a word. BBB is not a word. CCC is not a word. So those aren't words. Maybe OOO is, ooh, that's a word. Maybe. But other than that, and again, there are all kinds of combinations. Obviously, AND, CAT, DOG. There are many combinations that you could have that actually mean something. But there are far more unuseful, unhelpful combinations than there are useful combinations. And that's true for 3 letters, but it's also true as you increase the number of letters in your word. So let's say we have 4 letters in our word instead of 3. Now, we just said that for a 3-letter word where there are 20 letters in our alphabet, that would mean there are 8,000 different combinations. Okay, if I add 1 letter, how many combinations does that make? Potentially. Well, it would be 8,000 times 20, right? So we're talking about now 160,000. So now you're at 160,000 different combinations that you could have. Let's go one more. Let's go to 5. If we now multiply 160,000 times 20, what is that? Well, 160,000, 1.6 million, 3.2 million. So if you have a 5-letter word with 20 letters in your alphabet, then you would have 3.2 million combinations, different combinations of letters that could create a word. But how many of those 3.2 million 3.2 million combinations of letters are actually words? Not that many. In fact, there's probably fewer 5-letter words than there are 3-letter words, right? That would make sense. It's easier to do a shorter word. But then there are exponentially more possible combinations. So you went from 8,000 to 3.2 million. Can you see the problem? That there are probably fewer 5-letter words that are actually good words or useful words than there are 3-letter words, but there are astronomically more potential combinations. Now, that brings us to this idea of mutations and random mutations creating the kinds of changes in code that we need. You see, let's say you have an amino acid that needs a sequence of 150 amino acids. So you have a protein. In order to create the protein, let's say, you need 150 amino acids in a string, let's say, to get that, whatever that is. You can see very quickly, I just showed you that there are 3.2 million combinations of just a 5-letter word. And there are very few of those 3.2 million that are actual words. Likewise, if you have this sequence of 150 amino acids and it needs to be a certain way to get something to work, there are very few of them that are actually useful. So if there are very few that would actually be useful, and you're saying that random changes would actually help, that just doesn't make any sense. That's not how it works. I write code. You can change a letter and the whole thing won't work. And so now we're saying that corrupted code via mutations can somehow produce improvements over time rather than it deleting genetic information. And so this idea of the combinatorics of evolution is one people were already talking about this in the 60s and 70s, but it's one of those things that if you're a fan of evolution, you don't want to talk about it because it starts getting to be mathematically prohibitive that this is something that just could have happened through random processes, through the use of mutations. So we're saying that this is an undirected process that somehow stumbles upon a needle in a haystack over and over and over again. That sounds like faith to me. When you're saying repeatedly and a random, undirected, unguided process happens upon a combination of amino acids that produces proteins, when we can see that from a combinatorics perspective, it's not a needle in a haystack. It's a needle in a haystack the size of the earth or even larger. And we're saying that natural selection just happens upon these kinds of combinations. Mathematically, that doesn't work. And so this is something that Doug Axe was finding, that again, if you were to be able to produce a new functional protein from all of the potential sequences of 150 amino acids, the chance of that is 1 chance in 10 to the 77th power, which is a ridiculously small probability. It's a statistical zero. Now that's to do that 1 time. But in order for life to be able to begin, in order for there to be changes where you can make new proteins in the way that the evolutionary story says, what you now have to do is believe that thing that is astronomically small in its probability continually happens, that it happens all the time. Never mind, we never see it happen, and we see that the odds of such happening are prohibitive. We're just supposed to take this statistical zero probability and believe that it happened over and over and over again, and it just doesn't happen anymore. That is the thing that you're being told when people talk about evolution. And so the mathematics of evolution, this gets back to what we're talking about. When you start getting into some really hard sciences like engineering, when you actually apply engineering and apply math to these ideas that these biologists have come up with, what you find out very quickly is that there's not much to it. There's not real hard science behind it. There's a lot of wishful thinking. There's a lot of storytelling. So the thing about macroevolution is that it is a story about monkeys or apes of some kind turning into humans. It's a story that people tell. But when you start doing hard science, it falls apart. And this is why we continue to point this out. And so to try to force this upon kids is ridiculous. It's interesting. I was talking to a young man the other day, and he is in the 7th grade. And he said he was in class and his science teacher was teaching them about evolution. And of course, he doesn't believe in evolution. He, is a believer. And so while he was in the class, he raised his hand and he asked his teacher, if humans come from monkeys, then why do we still have monkeys? So his teacher had to pause for a second. And she said, well, the stupid monkeys didn't evolve and they stayed monkeys. Now think about that for a second. The stupid monkeys didn't evolve and they remained monkeys. Now you can see one of the things I quickly saw when it came to that is how easily the logical conclusion of that moves you toward racism, right? That there's some people that are much closer to those monkeys, those stupid monkeys, than others. There are some people that are more evolved. There are some people that are educated and better, superior to those inferior races. If you know anything about Darwin's On the Origin of Species, he calls it the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life, right? Favored races. And yes, he calls people savages in that book. So the thing about it is that kind of idea, you can see how it's not scientific because it leads to something that's not scientific, like racism. But you have to ignore the anti-scientific nature of this to believe it. You have to just believe the story. Now, the other thing about mutations really quickly is that they do not affect epigenetics. And epigenetics is referring to non-genetic factors that will determine how a gene is expressed. So it's not actual code. So it's not code that determines, in many cases, how our genes will be expressed. Sometimes there are factors in our lives that can determine that. So you can have two twins that both have a certain genetic mutation or something like that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they both will get a certain disease or that they both won't. And so epigenetics, which is crucial when you're coming to building new body plans. Today, we're talking specifically about human beings coming from apes somehow. You're having a different kind of body plan. Epigenetics figures heavily into what would need to happen for there to be a new body plan. But the neo-Darwinian framework doesn't address epigenetics at all. And so these are just a few of the issues, but the point is that it's a story and you're just simply told to believe it. And when you don't believe it, then there are people that'll come out of the woodwork and try to come after you. And so this evolutionary story, fiction, fantasy, whatever you want to call it, there's no science behind it. When you start putting real science to it, then it starts falling apart. And I think we're seeing that more and more often. One of the things that happens, we talked about this earlier, you can see in the image here, I have an image of basically shadows of a quadrupedal ape moving up to a bipedal human. And one of the things we see is that in the fossil record, you see humans. In the fossil record, you see apes. In the fossil record, you do not see bipedal apes. And so they always add that bipedal ape in there to give a sense, to basically they want to suggest this progression that we actually don't see in the fossil record. And then they don't give you a series of selective pressures to show you how such a thing might have happened to have all of these different changes. And again, of course, you have mutations being your mechanism here. That doesn't make any sense. Okay, so if you're someone who hears all of that and say, well, man, the mathematical part is something that needs to be dealt with. Generally, you don't deal with it. And so people that maybe go through various evolutionary biology classes in school, they're not going to talk about that, because to talk about it completely undermines it. And when you're indoctrinating someone, you don't want to show them those kinds of facts because it would completely undermine the idea there. So we are pointing out that intelligent design makes a whole lot more sense if we're thinking about the prohibitive nature of these combinatorics that you would need to have biologically, that you would need to have from a genetics perspective. You would need to have, if you're, again, and that goes back to if you believe that evolution stuff. So even if you did believe evolution, you really need a God to guide it. But I'm saying that's not how he did it. But if you're going to believe that, you would need to believe in a God to go along with it, rather than saying, oh, well, it just kind of happened randomly. So here's the thing we point out. When you see all of the design in nature, but particularly in the human body, what you can do is you can say, well, that just happened to come about like that. And as a system, or as a robotics engineer, that's constantly thinking in terms of systems mindset, you don't create good systems randomly. You don't have random processes that develop and that will fabricate some new system. You have to plan it. That's what's behind design. And so one of the things I want to do for the third point here is just to point out the design inference and what we're talking about here, and how it makes a whole lot more sense to look at design there rather than trying to reject the possibility of God, which is what people generally do here. The famous quote, I forget the name of the man who said it, but he essentially said, we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. We can't allow a divine foot in the door. We can't allow there to be the possibility of God. So we've got to stick to this evolution story, or whatever it is that people are going with, abiogenesis, Big Bang, these kinds of things. We can't allow a divine foot in the door. We can only accept certain hypotheses. And so we see this all the time. When you see radiometric dating, you see various things that happen. Well, if that radiometric dating lines up with a date of thousands of years in terms of the year, in terms of the age of the Earth, all of a sudden we go, oh, but there must be something wrong with our instruments here. And they keep going until they get a date that they want to agree with, and then they give that date. Well, again, that's not science. And what happens is people will try to point to radiometric dating and ignore the fact that often when it comes to radiometric dating, they'll get dates, particularly with something like carbon-14, that points to thousands of years rather than millions or billions of years. And when those kinds of things come up, what people do is they say, oh, we must have had a problem, and we're going to keep testing, and we'll use these other methods until we get something that has a longer age. And so we'll talk more about age of the Earth in some later podcasts, I'm sure, and in some other videos. But that's often what happens. And that's, again, not science. So when it comes to the design inference, what we're essentially saying is, if I look at something that has been designed, right? So let's say computer code. And I say, hey, I clearly wrote this computer code. It didn't come about through random processes, right? Even if you talk about AIs writing computer code today, that doesn't happen through random processes. Somebody built the AI to be able to write the code. But you don't get code from random processes. So one of the illustrations that's, I don't want to say is burned in my memory, but I read some of Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker, and I believe this was, if I'm remembering correctly, this was his illustration. But he talked about how, well, if you had a bunch of monkeys tapping away and hacking away at typewriters, that you could eventually get something that was coherent out of that. And that was so interesting to me, because you're comparing that to something like DNA, for instance. And that's just not how it works. The idea that having enough time and chance will give you something that can actually be remarkable is actually not how it works. The more time that elapses and the more chance that there is randomly, you get random gobbledygook. So for us to look at code that we write and say, oh yeah, that's designed. But then we look at DNA, which has clearly been engineered, and it far exceeds anything that we've done code-wise. And to look at that and say, well, no, that's randomly generated, is an anti-engineering idea. You're completely throwing out everything we understand about how code comes to exist. If you think about a pump, you say, yeah, someone invented that pump. Of course they did. It didn't just come about like that. And then we look at the human heart, which is a marvel of mechanical engineering. And we say, well, mutations happen over time, and that's how that came to exist. It's ridiculous. If we look at a humanoid robot modeled after the human body, of course we're going to say it's a design, and we're impressed by it. But then we look at the human body that has a number of interconnected systems that work together. And we look at this system of systems that is the human body, and we say, oh yeah, it evolved. There was no thought behind it. It is, I mean, of course, it's a slap in the face to God, and that's what people mean by it, I assume. But if you're listening to all this and you're saying, well, it doesn't have to. It doesn't mean that there has to be a God. Okay, I mean, I can understand that, but we have to get past this neo-Darwinian evolution thing, though. Now, what I'm saying is, I don't see any comparable explanation once you get away from neo-Darwinian evolution, except intelligent design. There's a God who did this. There is some kind of, this is all evidence of a creator, a designer of some kind. And that's what we come to here. And so one of the things I want to point to two specific things when it comes to design that I look at and say, this is clearly designed. Because when it comes to design, what happens is people will say, well, the fact that I, fell and tore my ACL, if God had made the leg different, then I shouldn't have torn my ACL. Or someone might look and they might say, well, the fact that my eyes aren't working properly, that's a bad design. And these are called dysteleological arguments. Dis meaning bad, and the teleological part just means refers to design. And so dysteleological arguments, the problem with them is that you're still talking about design. A bad design is still designed by somebody. So you can look at a picture and say, well, that's a terrible piece of art. But you would never say, well, no one did that. No one made that. You see that someone made it. And so when we're talking about the design argument, if you want to go to dysteleological arguments, which is often what these biologist types do, the problem is if it's bad design, it's still design. So you still are at the same place where we see design here, and you're claiming that it doesn't come as a result of designer, and yet that's what we regularly observe. So what you have to believe is that design can arise apart from a designer, and that's just not how it works. Okay, so there are two things that we see, particularly in the human body, that are really interesting when we're thinking about design, and why design is a far better explanation for the walking on two legs and the standing and the balance that we have as humans than this evolutionary pseudoscience. The first thing is, as we're thinking about there being a designer of the bipedalism of humans, is that designers put redundancies in the systems they make. Now, this is something I know firsthand from when you're writing code, when you're building a robot. You don't want something that if there's a single error, the entire thing shuts down, the entire thing breaks. You want as much as possible to put redundancies into your system. The human body is composed of several subsystems, and they work together. And what's really interesting about the human body is that you can see the redundancies that are in place. So, for example, one example to use is how you can realize that you're off balance, that there are multiple things that work together that give you that even if one of those things doesn't work, you still have a sense of being off balance, and you can sense that and make adjustments accordingly. So one of the things that happens, let's say you're standing in place, I walk over to you and I push you. There are multiple things that happen that alert you to the fact that you have been pushed off balance. The first thing is that you feel me push you. And through training over time, you understand that push is something that is a destabilizing force that's been applied to you. And so you already are reacting to the fact that I pushed you. One thing that happens is if you're standing stably and I push you, you can feel a weight shift at your feet. So even if you didn't feel me push you, let's say the wind blew or something and that pushed you, or you just didn't notice the push, you will feel how your body shifts at your feet, and you'll feel that weight shift. A third thing is that your vision. So if you're looking, you will see a motion, you'll see a change, and that will alert you to a motion is happening, and that was unexpected, and I was expecting to be standing still. And then a fourth one is your vestibular system. If you think about in your inner ear, there's a sense of balance that you get there. So there are other things I'm sure that if I thought a little harder, we could come up with that give you that sense of imbalance. But the point is that, let's say your vision is off, or let's say that you're blindfolded, would you still be able to sense being off balance? Well, of course you would. So you don't simply look at one of those things, or if one of those things failed, that wouldn't completely throw your balance off or your sense of balance. And so God does these things all throughout the human body. There are all kinds of redundancies. There are all kinds of things in place that if this doesn't work, something else will come in and take its place. We see this throughout the human body, and that is precisely what designers do to keep whatever the thing is that they're designing from breaking, from not being functional because of a small issue. So we don't want small breakdowns to completely throw us off balance, pun intended. So in this case, we're saying the existence of redundancies throughout the subsystems of the human body are repeated examples that we have someone who engineered this thing, and it's not something that just came about through random processes. There's no reason from an evolutionary perspective to have redundancies. Like, it just doesn't make sense. You just have to believe it first. Now, the second thing is learning. And this is one of my favorite topics, is when you think about the idea of learning, it is literally a reversal of the idea of entropy from the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy is this idea of chaos that accumulates over time. And learning is a way to order things. And so the fact that we learn so well is not something that evolves. You don't evolve a learning controller, which is the kind of thing I was doing when I was doing my doctoral work. You don't evolve one. And even if you did, you would have to design a system to evolve a learning controller, you see, because otherwise, how are you going to learn over time, which means to get better at doing certain things and to reduce mistakes. And so that's something we do very well. We learn to walk from scratch relatively quickly. If we took a robot, right now, there's a lot of work being done where robots are learning walking from scratch. That was some of the work that I was doing. But it takes many, many, many reps to get that to work. But if you added up all the reps for a baby growing into a toddler, they learn very fast compared to our best algorithms. So what we're saying here, though, is that there was some randomness that developed learning. But when we design these algorithms that are far worse at learning than human beings, well, those weren't designed. Those were just, they kind of came about randomly over time. I can tell you, coming up with some random algorithm is not going to get learning. It just won't. And if you think about it, you'll see why. It's random. You're not going to get any learning to develop. You're not going to be able to keep the good, reject the bad. You have to design algorithms for that. And the idea that the fact that we as humans, every healthy human learns walking. Everybody does. It's 100%. Every healthy human learns to walk. A 100% learning algorithm is unheard of in artificial intelligence. It's impossible. And what is being claimed is that just occurred through random processes. That the ability of human beings to learn bipedal locomotion from scratch, every human being learns it. That the idea that came about through random processes is frankly ridiculous. I've designed AI algorithms to do that. And you can design these AI algorithms. You will not come up with a 100% one. If you do, then you're creating some different kind of problem. But when we're talking about the problem of what we do, how well and how efficient and how effective our walking is, the idea that there's 100% pass rate here is one of the most remarkable things about human beings. And if you want to believe that algorithm came about through random processes, be my guest. It's just not science. And so when we start applying these concepts from artificial intelligence, when we start applying these concepts from mathematics and engineering, what you find out very quickly is that design makes the most sense. And what doesn't make sense are these random processes that apparently came about that you never observe. Okay, so none of this stuff makes sense. This idea of evolution designing. Evolution doesn't design anything. All it does is tear things down, and all it does is make things worse. The accumulation of mutations over time is actually something through genetic entropy that is creating more disease, not less. So the design syllogism goes something like this. Every design thing originates from a designer. The human body is a design thing. Therefore, the human body originated from a designer. It's pretty straightforward. And so you could try to attack the idea that the human body is a design thing, but as we've seen, what's your alternative? To say that all of the redundancies in humans, our ability to learn the way we do, that came about through random processes? Where do we see it? Please show something in a measurable, verifiable way that learning happens through random processes. It doesn't. Show the existence of redundancies in a design that happen through random processes. It doesn't. The idea that it's designed means that there is deliberation, there is thought behind it. And that thought means that there's a mind. And as believers, we understand that mind is the mind of God. And so when we're looking at the science of this stuff, what we see very quickly is that this body that we enjoy, our ability to walk on two legs, is the result of God. It's not something that can be explained accurately apart from God. And so you can have these biologists like Richard Dawkins and these guys that don't do any engineering, they don't do any mathematics, they're not doing any artificial intelligence. You're not having to build things, or you ignore the combinatorial explosion of possibilities, but the relatively small number of useful combinations. And when you look at that, you see that mathematically it doesn't work. Engineering wise, it doesn't work. From an intelligence perspective, what we see in us, it doesn't work. And I'm sure there are other areas as well, but these are the areas that I'm more familiar with. So that's what we wanted to talk about today. Over the next couple of weeks, we've got a couple of guests that are coming on. Maybe the next 2 to 3 weeks. I know Thanksgiving's coming up. I may be able to slide a solo pod in there somewhere, but that's it for this week. Those of you who are believers, the science is with us. The inventors and the originators of modern science were with us who are believers. And you don't have to shy away from that or back down from people who are trying to drill into your head because they've been indoctrinated to do so, that evolution is somehow true. It's not. And so there is a God. He is alive. In him we live and we survive. From dust our God created man. He is our God, the great I am. This is what we believe. We understand that God made us. And so that's what the science points to as well. And so so this is the Faith Science Podcast. We look at how science integrates with our faith, and it does so seamlessly. That's it for today. Until next time, keep asking questions and keep the faith.